but using a comparative bar chart. Okay. All right. So when we're working with our spreadsheet here, and we want to do deal with categorical variables, I'm taking the strategy of using pivot tables. Like I said, there are pluses and minuses to taking this particular strategy. There's like other ways that we could count up these particular values, but they all have their own little weird complexities. So we're going to use a pivot table again, and if you guys remember, to start a pivot table, basically we select the entirety of the data. So I'm using this small data to kind of illustrate it. So we have everything selected, and this is exactly what we did when we were doing kind of our one variable pivot tables. Okay. And if you remember, we go back to data, we go to pivot table. I like inserting it into the existing sheet because, you know, to be honest with you, I think the reason that they have by default that these pivot tables go in their own sheets is that generally when people make pivot tables, they're making really, really big, complicated ones that have like a lot of different factors in them. And, you know, there's usually not space on a data sheet for that. But for our purposes, I think we're going to want to actually put them on our chart. So I'm going to go ahead and pick existing sheet and select the cell. Okay. All right, so right there, I'm ready to create. And just like before, we have the pivot table editor kind of popping up on the side. And if you remember, when we did that, we went to the rows and we picked the variable we were interested in. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and pick kind of our math 190 variable. Okay, so if I look at the math 190 variable, I have three labels. We have a no, we have one person who didn't do any response at all, and then we have a yes. Okay, so now what's going to be a little bit different than what we had before was that instead of going straight to values, I'm now going to pick something for the columns. So here's where I put in the other variable that I want to kind of simultaneously view. So in this case, math 190 is the one variable. The love of stats will probably be my other variable. So I have love of stats right there. And so what you'll see showing up here is the bones of a two-way table, right? We see love of stats there above, and you see the columns are divided up by the love of stats. We see math 190 labeled kind of over on the side, and that's telling us the rows are speaking about math 190 responses. And we're basically almost there. And just like before, we go to values, and we're just going to pick one of the two variables, okay? It actually doesn't matter which one. I think you end up with the exact same. So I'm going to pick love of stats. And once I fill that in, just notice that the entirety of the table fills out. We do have some zeros that we should be accounting for that they don't fill in. They just kind of leave it blank. There was no yeses here in the yes category. There was no, in the no response people, there was only one, so they only take up one spot here. But yeah, that's our basic two-way table. Okay. And now to create our comparative bar chart, we're just going to highlight everything but the grand total. So you start from this corner here, go down, do not select the grand total row or there. Okay. And then I'm going to go to insert chart. And once again, it makes a guess. It doesn't necessarily guess correctly, but today it did. So if it didn't guess correctly, if it did some other sort of graph, it often will pick stacked column charts for this type of data. So column chart right here, just go to column chart there. And remember, they use the term column chart to talk about the vertical, which is usually what we want. And they use the term bar chart to talk about basically the same graph, but looking horizontal. Okay. All right, so when I look at this, once again, I see that the Math 190 labels are along my x-axis. So these are basically all the people who said no, okay, that they did not take Math 190. These are all the people who said yes, which is, once again, a pretty small group. And these are all the no responses, okay? And right here, okay, the legend is kind of janky. It's not, this is actually one of the downsides of doing pivot tables. So basically you want to have in your title a bit of a memory or a bit of a label that allows people to know what you're talking about with the no's and the yeses there. So here, do students love stats? I think that kind of tells you what that means. So right here, we're looking at the no's. We have 10 students. The people who did not take 190, we have 10 students who don't love stats. We have 6 students who do. For the people who didn't respond, we have only 1 person and they said they do love stats. And then for the people who did take 190, we have basically everybody saying they don't love stats, at least in this random sample. Excuse me. Do you need them right this moment? Okay, just wait 1 minute and I need to get them started in their spreadsheets and I'll bring you a thin rubber band. Sorry about that. So once again, this is our bar chart. Now, remember we talked about, when we looked at this here, we talked about how we can have either a frequency scale here, or we can talk about a relative frequency scale, okay? And basically, what I want to talk about kind of next is how we make a relative frequency scale. But we want to be a little bit careful when we're making our relative frequency scale, because now that we have 2 variables here, we can take a lot of different percentages. And some of them are going to be useful and some of them aren't, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. Okay, so I have kind of like, when you copy a pivot table, it's nice because it keeps the selection of all the data, and then you can kind of just play around with it. So now when I look at this right here, this pivot table, if you remember before, the way that we got the pivot table to show percentages rather than just raw counts was down here in the values, instead of having it show as a default, we go to below it and it says percentage of row, percentage of column, or percentage of grand total. So we're going to have some different percentages that we can take, okay? So I'm going to show percentage of row first and then talk about what that just did. So do you guys see how the percentage, the 100% is down here at the end? Now, what I did when I took this percentage of the rows is I am finding the percentage of our Math 190, or percentage of the students who either took Math 190 or did not take Math 190 or did no response. So those are my separate groups, okay? And then what I'm looking at is the percentage of no's and yeses within those separate groups. So I'm dividing up the data based upon the rows when I do a row percentage, okay? Now, where is that useful? That is useful when we'd like to compare the differences between people who do Math 190 or not, because they're 2 very different size groups, okay? So if we want to compare, if we want to say that if we want to compare people based upon their taking Math 190 or not, this is the percentage that we want to take. Now, if we want to divide up the stats lovers or not, then we do a column percentage. And so in this case, now we are taking the group and we are first looking at them in terms of love of stats. And those are our distinct units when we're talking about the percentages. And then we're going to divide them up by whether or not they took stats or not. Then there's also the percent of the grand total. And I'm going to tell you guys, we hardly ever use this. So basically, this is just looking at each individual there as a percent of absolutely everybody. When we do comparisons, we hardly ever use that. Okay, so I'm going to pick the row one here. And then all I have to do to make a bar chart with the relative frequency scale is just to insert a bar chart from that contingency table with the percentages. Okay. So once again, I'm going to snip this portion out of the video and post it a little bit later so you guys can review it.